Hello there, and welcome to Sleep History Mystery, where quiet questions meet the unknown and wonder is allowed to take its time. Tonight, we're not chasing the edges of the universe or decoding the birth of stars. Instead, we're turning inward, downward, beneath our own feet. Because sometimes the strangest mystery isn't out there in the cosmos, it's buried right here, under layers of dust, stone, and silence. So here's the question. What if we're not the first? Not the first to think, not the first to build, not the first to ask who we are or why we're here. What if, long before pyramids, satellites, or bedtime stories told in whispers, another civilization rose on this planet? Not aliens, not myth, not Atlantis, but something real, something homegrown. A species born of this earth, intelligent in ways we might not even recognize, and ancient in a way that bends the timeline past recognition. What if they lived here and left, not in flames, not in legend, but in quiet? So quiet, in fact, that Earth itself may have forgotten them. If that sounds like a science fiction story, well, maybe it is. But it's also a serious scientific question, one with surprising evidence, one that's been asked by thinkers who know how to read the Earth like a history book with missing pages. And tonight, we'll ask it too, not to find proof, but to feel the weight of the question, to see the layers of Earth not just as geology, but as memory, and to wonder if someone else once walked here, built here, dreamed here. Would we even know? Let's begin. The Earth is old, and not just old in the way a story feels when told from mouth to mouth over campfires and centuries. No, ancient in the deep, unblinking way only a planet can be. 4.5 billion years of rising and crumbling, and we've only recently arrived. Most of that time, Earth knew nothing of us, or so we believe. We often think of ancient as 10,000 years ago, the time of Göbekli Tepe, the time of the pharaohs, the first marks carved into clay and stone. But to the Earth, that span is nothing. Not a heartbeat, not even a pause. It's closer to now than to almost anything else that has happened here. Entire mountain ranges have risen and fallen in longer stretches. Oceans have opened and closed. Continents have slid silently beneath one another, like puzzle pieces rearranged by an unseen hand. So what happens when we widen our lens? What stories does the silence begin to tell? If an intelligent species, something curious, social, capable of altering its world had emerged during the age of the dinosaurs, or long before, would it leave behind a mark we could still find? What would that trace look like? A monument? A machine? A whisper in the rocks? Or nothing at all? Because most things vanish. Time doesn't just pass, it presses down. It erodes, melts, swallows, and replaces. Civilization, for all its steel and concrete, is fragile. A city, left alone for a few decades, becomes overgrown. A few centuries, and the outlines blur. A few millennia, and even the foundations dissolve. Stretch that to millions of years, and the chances fall to near zero. And yet, maybe not zero. Maybe just low enough to make discovery feel like luck, and forgetting feel inevitable. To imagine a predecessor species isn't to chase fantasy, it's to measure the depth of our own impermanence, to hold our place in time with looser fingers, not because we have proof of what came before, but because we are still learning what gets remembered and what doesn't. So tonight, we won't climb pyramids or trace mythologies. We won't summon gods or ancient astronauts. Instead, we'll turn to sediment and signal, to isotopes and anomalies, to questions too slow for news headlines and too large for classrooms. We will look back not just through history, but through the very crust of the Earth. We will ask not, what if they were here, but what would it mean if they were, and we forgot? Let your thoughts quiet. Let time stretch. Because to follow this path, we need to move slowly, patiently, like the planet itself. This isn't a story, it's a signal, one we're just beginning to hear. Time is not a gentle river. It's a relentless sculptor, grinding everything into forgetfulness, smoothing sharp edges into unrecognizable shapes. What we call memory is fragile, and even geological record we treat as absolute, full of gaps, riddled with missing pages and eroded ink. We think we know the story of Earth because we've mapped it in layers, but those layers are torn, overwritten, recycled. The deeper we dig, the more we realize how much we've already lost. If an ancient civilization existed, something intelligent, organized, capable of reshaping its surroundings, it would not have needed to build monuments to be real. It could have risen in the silence between epochs. It could have fallen without a sound. And yet, some trace, however faint, might still remain, not in the obvious forms we expect, but in the subtle changes it left behind. That's the core of the Silurian Hypothesis. A question not about belief, but about detection. Not whether they existed, but the fossil record is not a photo album. It's a scattered set of impressions, a memory stitched together from lucky survivors. Most of what has ever lived left no trace. Most of what was built has crumbled. Even our most permanent works, bridges, tunnels, dams, are no match for tectonics, water, or time. Bones dissolve, steel rusts, plastics degrade under ultraviolet light. The evidence we imagine would last forever is already, in some cases, disappearing. If we want to find the past, we need to change how we look. Stop seeking statues. Start looking for signals. Geochemical fingerprints, anomalous isotopes, synthetic molecules that don't belong. These are the echoes that linger, not because they were meant to, but because they were hard to erase. The authors of the Silurian Hypothesis weren't suggesting that aliens or lizard people once ruled the world. They were asking a quieter question: what would industrial civilization look like in the rock record, me? To answer that, we must first understand what kinds of changes our own civilization is leaving behind. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've rewritten the chemistry of the air, the oceans, the soil. We've pumped carbon into the atmosphere, embedded plastics in the sediment, laced soils with nitrates and rare metals. These changes are slow, planetary, and persistent. If they're visible millions of years from now, they may be the only thing we're remembered for. So how would that apply to a civilization we've never found? If they burned fuel, the isotopes would show it. If they synthesized compounds, the sediments might preserve them. If they farmed, deforested, or altered the nitrogen cycle, those changes could linger in the stratigraphy. But these traces would be faint, scattered, stripped of all context. And the deeper you go in time, the more the planet rearranges everything. Because Earth does not archive, it recycles. The average age of the ocean floor is just 200 million years. The Earth itself is over 4.5 billion. That means most of the planet's surface has already been wiped clean more than 20 times. If an ancient civilization arose on land that has since been subducted, its remains are now part of the molten mantle, lost in the churn of geology. That's not conspiracy. That's plate tectonics. And so we are left, not with certainty, but with an invitation to consider what might have been, not to believe it blindly, but to understand the depth of our own ignorance. The question isn't whether they were here. It's whether we'd even know if they had been. When we talk about time, we speak in centuries. We think in calendars. But the Earth doesn't measure years the way we do. It counts in epochs, in glacial pulses, in the slow drift of continents. It remembers differently through pressure, heat, and layers. And it forgets efficiently. Most of what has ever happened here has vanished without a trace. So the question becomes not just what could survive, but what has any chance at all? Let's imagine, for a moment, a civilization not built on concrete and copper, but on organic materials: wood, resin, bone, fiber. Suppose it rose in a rainforest, or near a fertile coastline now swallowed by rising seas. Suppose it built nothing meant to last, or lasted only a few thousand years before vanishing into silence. What would remain? Not cities, not skeletons, maybe not even tools. Perhaps just a shift in the soil, a chemical echo, a missing pattern in the biodiversity we expected to find. It's easy to underestimate how fragile our own imprint is. Walk through a modern city, and everything feels solid, permanent. But pull the thread of maintenance, and decay rushes in. A few decades of neglect and vines break through concrete. Floodwater invades the subway. Paint peels, steel groans. In 100 years, the skyline is a ruin. In 1,000, it's barely recognizable. Give it 1,000,000, and even the shape of the land may be different. This isn't hypothetical, it's a preview. The processes that erase us have already begun. And if we vanish tomorrow, the record we leave behind would be fragmentary at best. Some future intelligence might find unusual isotopes in the rocks, a thin layer of plastic particles in the sediment, traces of combustion in the atmosphere. But would they know what it meant? Would they read it as civilization or mistake it for a natural event? Because nature produces anomalies too. Volcanic eruptions release carbon, meteor impacts scatter rare metals, methane bursts trigger warming. The Earth has its own vocabulary of disaster. If a future scientist found one of our fingerprints out of context, they might misclassify it. A plastic molecule mistaken for an organic byproduct. A spike in carbon written off as a volcanic phase. Not because they aren't intelligent, but because interpretation is always a mirror. We see what we're ready to see. This is where humility enters the frame. Not everything that can be known is obvious, and not everything that is true is easy to prove. When we search for signs of intelligence in deep time, we must look sideways. Not for monuments, but for distortions. Not for tools, but for disruptions. In rhythm, civilization, even ours, is a disturbance, a noise in the geological background. The question is whether the signal survives the static. What would last longest? Perhaps not our inventions, but our exhaust. Not our monuments, but our mistakes. The carbon in the air, the nitrogen in the soil, the redistribution of biomass, the chemistry of extinction. These are changes that endure not because they are meaningful, but because they are difficult to undo. So we return to the possibility. If another species reached this threshold long ago, their shadow might look like ours. Thin, partial, indirect, a shift, a smudge, a silence. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thought of all, not that we are the first, but that we are not even original. Some traces are more stubborn than others, not because they're meaningful, but because they resist decay. Glass, ceramics, certain alloys, these endure where wood and plastic do not. But even these relics, if left on the surface, can fracture, melt, or grind into invisibility, and underground? Pressure builds. Temperatures rise. Molecules rearrange. What was once an artifact becomes simply rock. But let's think differently. Suppose intelligence doesn't always leave behind artifacts. Suppose it leaves patterns. What would those look like? Perhaps altered landscape squares, pits, vast networks of extraction, perhaps reorganized ecosystems, where predator-prey dynamics no longer follow expected paths. Perhaps a sudden collapse in biodiversity, not because of volcanoes or asteroids, but because of imbalance, because of interference. This is the paradox of detection. We can imagine signs of a vanished civilization, but only if we imagine it behaving like us, using tools, burning fuels, building, changing. But intelligence may not express itself the same way every time. It might not industrialize. It might not build cities. It might not even leave the land. What if it lived in the ocean, spoke in chemicals, recorded memory through sound? Would we recognize it? We often mistake absence for non-existence. But silence is not proof. A lack of evidence is not the evidence of lack. And the earth is a master of silence. It buries, floods, melts, and grinds. It keeps secrets not by hiding them, but by erasing the context that would make them visible. The extraordinary, when stripped of meaning, looks ordinary. A carved stone becomes a rock. A synthetic molecule becomes just another anomaly in the core sample. So what does survive? What speaks across the vastness of time? Sometimes it's the unexpected. A layer of ash, an isotope shift, a deviation in sediment chemistry that doesn't match any known eruption or event. And sometimes that deviation is dismissed not because it isn't strange, but because we lack the framework to interpret it. The past cannot defend itself. It can only offer clues. Consider this. If someone or something had altered the atmosphere 100 million years ago, how would we tell? If they had released carbon at scale, changed the nitrogen cycle, or introduced compounds that nature does not make, what would it take for us to see that as a footprint? How many layers must agree? How many samples must align? And how many others have we already filed away under unusual but natural? We forget how narrow our window is. Most geological activity we study is recent because it's accessible, because it hasn't yet been crushed, melted, or subducted. But that bias blinds us. It leads us to believe that what we don't see must never have been. Yet whole continents have vanished. Whole oceans have been swallowed. Craters miles wide have disappeared. The canvas has been painted over, again and again. Still, we look. Still, we ask. Not because we expect a clear answer, but because the question itself sharpens our sight. It reminds us that we are not the measure of time, that history doesn't begin with us, that what came before may not be visible, but it may still be real. So we listen, not with ears, but with analysis, with attention to things that don't quite fit, because sometimes what doesn't fit is what matters most. What if survival isn't about being strong or permanent, but about being overlooked, about slipping beneath notice? That may be true of fossils, of structures, of entire civilizations. The louder something is in its time, the faster it may disappear in deep time. Heat, wind, pressure, tectonics. These don't care for legacy. They press equally. They erase impartially. So we return to the question not whether something existed, but how we would know. The Earth has erased more than we've discovered. And what we have found is often a flukia creature caught in a landslide, a tree sealed in amber, a city buried under ash. Preservation is not the norm. It's the accident, the exception. And history, as we know it, is built on exceptions. Now think of this. What if a civilization lasted only a few thousand years? What if it reached its peak, declined, and vanished before mammals had even emerged? That entire rise and fall would be compressed into a layer thinner than a coin in the geological record. A flash, a whisper. And if it didn't build in stone, if it didn't leave marks we can recognize, it might leave nothing at all. Or it might leave something, but something strange. A ratio of isotopes that doesn't match known processes. A chemical residue that has no clear origin. An unexpected pattern of extinction or sediment deposition. We already find anomalies like these, and most are explained by natural events, but a few remain ambiguous. The problem is not that we lack imagination. It's that science demands restraint. To claim intelligence, you need evidence, but the evidence of intelligence might not look like what we expect. It might be erased, degraded, scattered, and in the absence of context, even the extraordinary can look mundane. Let's ask a harder question. If humans disappeared today, how long would our memory last in the earth? 1,000 years from now, forests will have swallowed cities. 10,000, and most buildings will be dust. 100,000, and the continents will have shifted. 1,000,000, and much of what we are will be lost. Except for the trace chemicals, the shifts in carbon, the scattered plastics embedded in sediments. These are our real fossils, not bones. but byproducts. Not monuments, but chemistry. The planet may not remember our names, but it might remember our combustion, our industry, our waste. Now reflect on that in reverse. If we can imagine our own disappearance, we can imagine another's, not just theoretically, but structurally. What would remain of them? The same things, or less. If they were organic, if they lived lightly, if they adapted rather than built, their civilization might have left almost no trace. And yet, the Earth may still carry their fingerprint, a light one, partial, but not absent. The mystery isn't whether Earth has been shaped by intelligence. The mystery is whether we'd know it if it had, because what we call natural may not always be. And what we assume is random may, in some cases, be residue. We don't need fantasy to entertain the idea of ancient intelligence. We only need to accept how little survives sand, how little we've truly seen. So we return to the rocks, the soil, the oceans, not to dig up proof, but to understand how fragile the past ice and how blind the present can be. The sea remembers differently. It doesn't preserve, it dissolves. It grinds. It spreads. If a civilization lived near coastlines, as ours does, and disappeared, the ocean would not cradle its memory. It would erode it grain by grain. Saltwater corrodes, waves scatter, and beneath the surface, sediments pile in quiet layers, burying everything slowly, but not always kindly. Over the last 20 years, sea levels have risen over 100 meters. Entire landscapes now lie submerged river systems, forests, and perhaps, if they ever existed, settlements. These ancient coastlines are out of reach, buried beneath tons of water and silt. We speak often of what we've found, but we forget how much we've never even looked at. Underwater archaeology is young, limited by depth and technology. We scan small regions, we extrapolate cautiously, and the deeper we go in time, the harder it becomes to distinguish natural formations from the unnatural. A straight line might be coincidence. A formation may be geological. Without context, even real evidence becomes speculation. And yet, what if the ocean does hold memory? Not in artifacts, but in chemistry. Pollution from our industry's plastics, heavy metals, radioisotopics already reaching the deepest ocean trenches. If we are leaving signals there, so could someone before. Traces embedded not in ruins, but in mineral profiles. A spike of something artificial in a core sample. But it would take a trained eye, a patient one, to notice. Because that's the real challenge in art, whether a signal survives, but whether we are looking in the right place with the right expectations. Our bias is temporal. We expect intelligence to look like us, to leave the marks we would leave, to follow our trajectory. But there are countless other paths, other expressions of awareness. Some may be ecological, not technological. A civilization that sees itself as part of the biosphere might build differently. It might adapt instead of reshape. Its legacy would not be monuments, but balance or imbalance. Its traces would not be machines, but modified ecosystems, shifted nutrient flows, extinct species that otherwise shouldn't be. This is why some scientists search for strange layers. Layers where the usual rhythm of sediment is broken, where the chemistry bends in ways we don't expect. These aren't proofs. They are questions, waiting, and maybe that's enough. Because history, deep history, does not speak clearly. It hums, it echoes, and sometimes it waits to be asked. Think about extinction, not in the dramatic, asteroid-hitting sense, but slow ones. Civilizational extinctions, cultures fading into forests, languages silenced, not by war, but by time. Could a civilization pass away so quietly that the planet forgets? Not only possible, but likely. The fossil record shows bursts of innovation followed by sudden quiet. An organism evolves, spreads, and then vanishes. Some leave fossils, others do not. Some leave strange chemical marks that don't quite match known processes. A few perhaps changed the world and were then erased by it. We've built our understanding of evolution and extinction on the hard evidence we have. But that evidence is partial. It is built on luck and survival. What we don't see may be just as important as what we do. And among those absences, maybe, lies a whisper of something more. Take the Silurian Hypothesis again. Its beauty lies in its modesty. It doesn't declare. It asks, if a civilization existed long before us, would we detect it? And if we did, how would we distinguish it from natural events? A civilization doesn't need to span the globe to leave a mark. It could arise in isolation, flourish in a limited region, and vanish. Its traces might not be technological, but chemical. Not tools, but effects. A spike in carbon, an odd sulfur ratio, the sudden presence of synthetic-like compounds. But if these traces mimic natural phenomena, we might never know, because our filters are tuned to certainty. In science, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And that's good. That protects us. But it also means that some truths remain invisible until our questions change. What would it mean if we weren't the first? It wouldn't diminish us. It would humble us. It would place us inside a longer arc of planetary history, not as its culmination, but as its current chapter. It would remind us that intelligence isn't unique, that consciousness may rise again and again in forms we fail to recognize. So maybe we've already found the signal, and maybe it's sitting in a drawer somewhere, cataloged, labeled, but never truly seen. We often think of intelligence as linear, as progress, as upward motion from stone tools to satellites. But what if intelligence isn't a ladder? What if it's a tide, rising, receding, returning in forms we don't expect? In that light, the earth becomes a canvas painted over many times, not with clarity, but with overlapping strokes. Some visible, some faint, some buried beneath others. The goal isn't to find a full picture. It's to recognize that one might exist. That's why sediment cores are so important. They preserve time as layers each one, a snapshot, not of civilizations, but of chemistry, of what was happening on the planet, the air, the water, the temperature, the life. And among those layers, scientists sometimes find anomalies, a sudden increase in heavy metals, a dip in biodiversity, a shift in isotopes. Most are explained, some are not. Could one of them be artificial in origin? Possibly. But proving that is nearly impossible without context, without knowing what to look for, which is why the best questions are often the quietest ones. They don't shout, they suggest. They point to something that doesn't quite fit and ask gently, what else could this mean? And in that space between explanation and ambiguity, there is room for imagination. Not wild fantasy, but disciplined wonder. The kind that says, we are not the first. We are not the last. We are a sentence in a story too big to read all at once. If we listen carefully, not just to what's preserved, but to what's missing, we may learn more about what came before us than we thought possible. And in doing so, we might also learn how to preserve the best parts of what we are now. Sometimes the silence of the past is louder than its signals. A missing fossil record, an unexplained extinction, a period of warming with no clear cause. We treat these as puzzles, and rightly so. But sometimes, a puzzle is only a puzzle because we're looking at it with the wrong eyes. Take ocean sediments. They are Earth's archive, layered quietly, mile upon mile, grain by grain. In them are embedded traces of life and death, climate and catastrophe, change. If a civilization interacted with the ocean, polluted it, altered its chemistry, changed its ecosystem, some faint echo might remain. We already find microplastics at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. We find synthetic chemicals in the bodies of deep-sea organisms. If we're leaving those traces in barely over a century, imagine what could be left after thousands of years of industrial activity, or millions. But again, scale matters. To leave a mark visible in deep time, the changes must be global, or strange, or both. Most of what we do is already fading. Our satellites will fall, our buildings will crumble. But a shift in carbon isotopes, a thin layer of synthetic compounds, those might outlast everything else. Which brings us back to the idea. If we can change the planet in ways that become geology, so could someone else. Not as myth, not as metaphor, but as chemistry, as imbalance. As a planetary fingerprint, the key is pattern. One anomaly can be dismissed, but a series of them, aligning across space and time, suggests something more. And maybe, in some future lab, or even today in one already forgotten, someone has seen that pattern. They just don't know what they're looking at. Yet, let's say, for a moment, we found something. Not a statue or a tool, but a signal, a shift in the rock record, an unexpected compound, something that doesn't belong. What would we do with it? First, we'd test, then test again, and most likely, we try to fit it into known models. A natural anomaly, a rare event, an error. Only if it refused to fight, only if it resisted every other explanation might we ask the deeper question, could this be artificial? That hesitation is not weakness, it's rigor. But it also shows how fragile the idea is, not because it lacks power, but because it lacks precedent. We've never found such a signal, or if we have, we haven't named it. And that's what this is really about. Not proof, but perception. How we see, how we interpret, whether we're willing to admit how much we don't know, and how open we are to what might still be found. Because even if no ancient civilization ever existed, this question changes us. It widens our view. It loosens the grip of certainty. It reminds us that the earth is not ours, not permanently, not uniquely. We are stewards of a moment, one blink in a long, long sequence. And whether or not someone came before us, someone may come after. Someone may look at what we leave behind and wonder the same thing we do now. Who were they? What did they build? Why did they vanish? If our only legacy is a chemical signal in the stone, let it be one worth finding. What does it mean to leave a legacy in stone, not by choice, but by consequence? To be remembered not for monuments or art, but for the chemical dissonance we leave behind. That's the haunting reflection at the core of these deeper questions. Not if someone was here before, but how we'd even know if they were. Because memory, in the geologic sense, isn't memory as we understand it. It's not about meaning. It's about persistence. We often think of our time as the apex of all time, but the earth doesn't share that view. It doesn't celebrate us. It doesn't even notice. It absorbs. It digests. It cycles. And in that cycling, it wears down the things we consider permanent. Skyscrapers, gone in centuries. Roads, forests, even our satellites will fall, pulled back by the quiet insistence of gravity. Yet, in the deep layers of rock, there are traces of epochs we don't fully understand. Spikes in carbon, interruptions in sediment flows, chemical footprints with no clear origin. We analyze them. We model them. We assign them to volcanism, to meteor strikes, to the pulse and throb of nature itself. But what if one of those events wasn't nature? What if it was culture forgotten, erased, ground back into the crust, but not entirely gone? We may never know what shape an ancient intelligence took. It may not have looked like us. It may not have thought like us. It may not have needed language, or metal, or tools. But if it changed its environment, burned forests, mined metals, synthesized compounds, then some part of it might still echo in the stone, not as artifact, but as anomaly. And this raises an even more delicate thought. If we are not the first, then we are also not the only ones capable of forgetting. perhaps the Earth has carried not one intelligence, but many, each emerging, reshaping, vanishing, each leaving behind a different kind of memory, and each new civilization blind to the ones before. We assume that history moves forward, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it loops, maybe it resets, or maybe it pulses, like breath intelligence rising and falling with planetary rhythms we've barely begun to detect. We don't need to rewrite geology to entertain this. We only need to look more closely at what doesn't fit. A signal without a sender, a change without a cause. These are the places where forgotten stories might be hiding, stripped of context, robbed of narrative, but still present, still waiting. So when we look to the rocks, to the oceans, to the quiet layers beneath our feet, we're not just studying the past. We're asking whether some past, far older than we dare imagine, might still be here. Not in full, not intact, but in pieces. Enough to whisper, enough to wonder, because maybe the planet has told this story before. Maybe we're living in the echo. Let us linger in that echo, not for what it says, but for what it nearly says. For the shapes that emerge when you stop listening for language and start listening for patterns. Because memory, in the geological sense, is not about clarity. It is not a diary or a monument. It is a compression, a smudge, a pressure mark left behind after everything else has vanished. There are moments in Earth's deep past that don't add up. Layers where the chemistry changes too fast, where ecosystems collapse and rebuild with unnatural symmetry, where extinction pulses ripple out not from a volcano or a comet, but from something else. And though we have theories, models, reconstructions, a part of us remains uneasy, because a few of these events feel familiar. Imagine a civilization that didn't build skyscrapers or carve cities from stone, one that saw itself not as separate from the planet, but as an extension of it. Its tools might have been biological, its architecture, living, its impact, subtle at first, but even harmony leaves a footprint, a redirected river, a modified climate, an imbalance too delicate to explain through randomness alone. If such a civilization collapsed, would we know? Or would we explain the traces away as anomaly, as quirk, as volcanic misfire or asteroid echo? We like answers. Science is built upon them. But the Silurian Hypothesis doesn't offer answers. It offers a lens, a method for looking at what doesn't fit. Not to prove a theory, but to soften the grip of assumption. To consider that the past may hold more than the bones and stones we've cataloged. So we go to the data. Ice cores, sediment layers, fossil transitions. We examine isotopic ratios, scan for carbon spikes, map strange mineral deposits. Each discovery is a sentence, and some of them just a few, not end with a period. They trail off, as if something was started that never finished, or something finished that left no clear beginning. And in those moments of uncertainty, a new kind of story begins. One not driven by certainty, but by possibility, by restraint, by wonder. We become translators of silence, not noise. We begin to see the world not just as it is, but as it might once have been layered, recursive, mysterious. Because history isn't just what's left behind, it's also what's erased. And if intelligence rose before us and fell before memory, then its truest legacy may be the questions it leaves in our minds, not the tools it left in the ground. So we continue, not in search of proof, but in search of better questions. And maybe that's the most important shift. Not asking, what did they leave? But what are we blind to? Because blindness is not just absence of sight, is the refusal to question the frameworks we've built. Our archaeology is shaped by expectation, our geology by precedent, our science by the stories we believe are likely. But Earth has no obligation to align with our narratives. If a civilization rose and vanished, It may have been one step ahead of our detection methods, or one step to the side existing in a realm we haven't considered. Perhaps it didn't need plastic, or leave behind combustion residues. Perhaps its signal is biological, a genome altered and then forgotten, a species that shouldn't exist where it does. To embrace this line of inquiry isn't to abandon science, it is to stretch it, to let it hold uncertainty as a form of inquiry. The world is full of noise, but in that noise are harmonic, subtle, fleeting, half-formed truths. And sometimes those are the most important ones of all, because they remind us that the universe isn't just what we can prove, it's also what we're learning how to notice. The danger of only studying what survives is that we miss everything designed not to. Most ancient civilizations we know built from stone, not because it was ideal, but because it endures. But what about cultures that built from light materials, or from living systems? What about those that weren't obsessed with permanence? Their histories would fade, quickly dissolved into soil, reclaimed by weather, erased by time's indifference. And yet, absence is not the same as emptiness. The earth holds patterns, and sometimes those patterns refuse to make sense. They don't align with tectonics, with natural disasters, with the known timelines of evolution or extinction. They are like echoes from a room that shouldn't exist. That's where this mystery begins, not in what we find, but in what we can't explain. In the carbon isotope ratios that shift too quickly, in the trace metals that appear without a source, in the sedimentary disruptions that don't match any known flood or quake. We try to fit them into known categories, because that's what we're trained to do. But maybe they don't belong there. Maybe they belong to something we haven't yet considered. What if intelligence doesn't always scale the same way? We assume that it grows outward: cities, machines, satellites. But perhaps it can turn inward. A biological intelligence, deeply integrated with its biosphere, might never leave behind a city. But it could still shape oceans, alter climates, bend ecosystems to its needs. We might read those changes as natural variation. But if we knew what to look for, if we expected more from the past, we might start to see intelligence not as the exception, but as a repeating rhythm. Because intelligence may not be a peak, it may be a pulse. It's possible we're one wave in a long sequence, and like all waves, we'll crest, crash, and dissolve. But if others have done the same, they may have left behind more than we know: subtle signatures encoded not in monuments, but in misalignments. An extinction too fast, a reef collapse with no warming trigger, a tree species that appears out of time. Things we dismiss as anomalies. But what if the anomalies are the truth? To consider this is to reshape our assumptions, to see geology not just as a record of rock, but as a kind of slow language. And in that language, we might begin to detect patterns, the cadence of past minds. Not in fossilized skulls, but in fossilized choices, in restructured soils, in chemical shifts that don't fit the mold. This doesn't mean we've found proof, but it means we're asking the right kind of question. A question that doesn't flatten the past into myth or dismiss it as irrelevant. A question that holds the door open, that listens. Because maybe we are not the first to ask where we came from. Maybe we are only the first to forget. And forgetting is easy when the evidence is subtle, when the past doesn't shout, but whispers, when intelligence leaves behind only its side effects, not its architecture, a rebalanced nutrient cycle, a cascade of extinctions that ripple through the food web without a predator in sight, a region of Earth where something shifted permanently, but with no known agent. These are not stories in the traditional sense. They have no names, no dates, no heroes, but they might still be messages. Not meant for us, perhaps, but left behind, all the same. The question is not whether we'll find a temple buried in shale. It's whether we'll learn to recognize patterns of intention without design, impact without infrastructure, a ghost print on the rhythm of the biosphere. Because in the end, the planet doesn't care if we remember, but we might, if we listen hard enough, start to remember something older than ourselves. Let's imagine the Earth as a palimpsesta manuscript, written, erased, and rewritten over billions of years. Beneath every layer, a previous story faintly persists, not clearly, not intact, but just enough to raise doubt, enough to haunt the margins of certainty. Geologists read these stories in layers of rock and dust, each stratum a chapter compressed into centimeters. Some are clear, an impact here, a volcanic winter there, the slow crawl of plate tectonics. But some are blurred, a carbon surge without fire, a die-off without disease, a sudden silence in the fossil record that arrives too fast and vanishes too neatly. These aren't mysteries of science. They are invitations. And if we follow them long enough, we begin to hear something unspoken, a question the Earth might be asking us. In return, have you truly looked? Because much of what we call natural is just the default category for what we cannot yet explain. We look at a spike in atmospheric methane and assume wetland expansion. We notice a global temperature anomaly and suggest a feedback loop. But what if these were outcomes, not causes? What if something once triggered them something with intention? The danger of this line of thought is not that it leads us to fantasy, but that it forces us to see how thin our certainties really are. We build models, yes, but they are only as good as the assumptions beneath them. And when we question those assumptions gently, systematically a different shape begins to emerge. A shape that might resemble intelligence, not as a presence, but as an influence. Imagine a culture that never left behind buildings, but altered the very metabolism of its planet. That triggered feedback loops, not through industry, but through bioengineering. That never carved its name in stone, but rewrote the cycles of rain and light and nutrient exchange. How would we recognize such a legacy? Perhaps in the gaps between what should be and what is. In forests that regrew too slowly. In oceanic dead zones that emerged and then receded without clear cause. In the thinness of certain fossil layers, too uniform, too clean. We might read it all as accident, or we might begin to suspect pattern. And suspicion, here, is the first step toward vision. We're not just looking for structures, we're looking for system-level changes that persist beyond the life that caused them. And that's a subtle art, because the Earth is always in flux, always erasing, rebalancing, recalibrating. To find the fingerprint of a vanished intelligence, we must find what resists that balance, what sticks out, what lingers too long, not as artifact, but as echo. Because echoes are what remain when the voice is gone. And in the strata beneath our feet, some echoes have yet to be heard. And if we do hear them, these subtle, lingering anomalies, we must resist the urge to explain them away too quickly. Science does not thrive on certainty alone. It breathes through curiosity, through the gaps that refuse to close. A spike in metal concentrations with no mine. A pattern in plant extinction that doesn't fit the climate model. These are not just footnotes. They may be fingerprints. We are so used to seeking intelligence among the stars, but rarely do we consider that the signal might be buried beneath us. Not in alien code, but in altered flows of phosphorus. In interrupted cycles of bloom and decay, in the breath of the atmosphere, held slightly differently for a geological blink. To embrace this possibility is not to abandon reason. It is to sharpen Ito, expand its range, to ask what kind of presence could leave a trace that hides inside natural processes, that bends them just slightly, just enough, and to ask, humbly, if we ourselves will be recognized by those who come next. Because if we fade, we will leave something behind, not in monuments, but in the marrow of the earth. That is where the deepest memories are stored. We often imagine history as a straight line from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge. But the earth doesn't move in lines. It turns, it spirals, it forgets. And in that forgetting, something profound happens. Stories become sediment, actions become chemistry, culture becomes climate, When we think about lost civilizations, we picture crumbling temples and buried statues, but those are artifacts of the surface. What if something deeper was lost, something less visible, but more enduring? A shift in global cycles, a rhythm interrupted, a harmony once struck between life and environment, and then suddenly gone. To look for that kind of legacy is to enter a different mindset, one that doesn't ask, where are the ruins, but where are the anomalies? And there are anomalies. There are strata where the fossil record abruptly changes too cleanly, too fast. There are mineral layers with concentrations that suggest processing, not accident. There are atmospheric blips that mirror industrial emissions, but long before we arrived, each one on its own is not enough. But together, they begin to hum, a background noise that doesn't fit the rest of the score. It's tempting to say, we'd know if someone came before us, but would we? If their culture didn't align with our markers of advancement, if they valued integration over domination, subtlety over spectacle, what would they have left? Perhaps only imbalance. A legacy, not of monuments, but of echoes in the biosphere. A layer of disrupted nitrogen flow. A wave of extinctions with no predator. A silence in pollen records, as if something once grew and then was deliberately undone. This is not fiction, it is a lens. And through that lens, the Earth begins to look less like a passive stage and more like a memory system. One that forgets slowly, one that remembers strangely. Because memory, when filtered through pressure and time, becomes unrecognizable, but not undetectable. The real challenge isn't the lack of evidence, it's our definition of evidence. We look for tools, bones, cities. But what if intelligence didn't build up, but spread out? What if it lived in forests, in oceans, in forms of cognition we don't yet understand? We assume intelligence must resemble us, that it must desire conquest, that it must leave behind proof. But perhaps intelligence, at its peak, leaves almost nothing behind because it learns not to. And so the deeper we look, the quieter it gets. Until, one day, we come across a layer in the rock, slightly different, slightly wrong, as if someone once whispered to the planet and then vanished into its breath. What remains is not a monument, it is a question, and sometimes questions are the most enduring structures of all. Because what we're searching for isn't always solid, it isn't always visible. Sometimes it's statistical noise that resists smoothing, a deviation from the expected that persists across unrelated domains, a biochemical footprint where no foot was expected. And that's where our tools begin to shift, not just picks and scanners, but algorithms and simulations. We're not just digging in the dirt, we're digging in data, looking for anomalies that might be intention in disguise, seeking shapes that shouldn't form, curves that don't belong, consistencies that feel too curated to be chaos. And in those patterns, those soft, almost not there irregularities, we might find what we've been missing. Not proof, but presence. A whisper in the archive of Earth. A mistake that wasn't a mistake. A choice made long ago whose echo still moves through the dust. And that echo might be the only monument we ever truly leave behind. There's something unsettling about the idea that we might not be the first. Not because it challenges our pride, but because it shifts our place in the story. We are used to being the climax, the pinnacle, the moment everything builds toward. But what if we're a reprise? A variation? A verse in a longer song we can't yet hear? This isn't just philosophy. It's a scientific framework that forces us to re-examine what we think intelligence looks like. Not just in form, but in effect. We've trained ourselves to see civilization in architecture, in metallurgy, in energy production. But these are just surface traits. They are expressions of a deeper process, the ability to alter a system in sustained, intentional ways. And by that measure, intelligence might appear in forms we've overlooked. Take the sudden reorganization of marine life 200 million years ago, or the pattern of soil development in pre-plant ecosystems, or the anomaly in oxygen isotopes that predates complex life. These aren't just curiosities. They're questions with fingerprints. We treat them as noise because we don't expect to find signal there. But what if we adjusted our expectations? What if we stopped searching for things that look like us and started looking for consequences that feel deliberate? An extinct biosphere isn't just a tragedy, it's a record. One we've barely started to read. Each leaf fossil, each pollen layer, each vanishing species is part of a sentence. And the syntax of that sentence may point not to chance, but to will. Imagine a civilization that mastered its biosphere so thoroughly, it left no waste. That understood entropy well enough to avoid it. That dissolved back into the planet on purpose. What trace would it leave? Not a ruin, but a pattern. A cascade of precision. A sudden reduction in chaos. That's what we may be seeing in parts of the geologic record. Not decay, but design. Of course, we can't prove that yet. Perhaps we never will. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't look. Because in that looking, we refine our tools. We sharpen our definitions. We build a new kind of lens zone that can see intention without form. And perhaps that's the next phase of our own intelligence. The ability to detect intelligence unlike our own. Because if we ever hope to find others beyond this world, or within it, we must first recognize that we are not the default. We are not the template. We are just one expression of a deeper possibility. And maybe, long before we carved satellites into the sky, that possibility spoke through coral and cloud, through soil and silence. Maybe we are not alone in the universe. Maybe we were never even alone on Earth. Because solitude is comforting until it's questioned, until we realize that silence is not absence, that what we fail to hear may not be gone, but speaking in a frequency we never thought to measure, that the past may not be past at all, but folded into the present in ways too subtle for our crude instruments. If another intelligence once lived here, it may have learned something we have not, that permanence is not resilience, that invisibility is not erasure, that legacy does not require witnesses' only effect. So we look again, and again, not for faces in the stone, but for rhythms that feel rehearsed, for chemical echoes, for deviations that don't decay the way they should, for signs that someone once understood this planet deeply enough to vanish without a trace except the kind that only time could reveal. Perhaps that is the highest form of intelligence, not conquering a world, but becoming so deeply part of it that the line between creator and created disappears. And if we can learn to see that, we might finally see ourselves differently too. If memory had a texture, it would feel like stone. Cold, slow, resistant, and yet, when cut open, it speaks. Every layer of rock is a paragraph. Every shift, every fracture, a punctuation mark. And yet some layers are different. They murmur. They pause, as if waiting for us to ask a better question. Geologists call these layers anomalies. But what if they're more than that? What if they're signals? Imagine a moment in deep time when everything changed, not gradually, but abruptly. Species vanish. Isotopic ratios swing wildly. Metals appear in concentrations that don't match any natural process. We call these mass extinctions, impact events, volcanic winters. But there's always one or two that don't quite fit the model. Events we wave away with unclear mechanism. But what if the mechanism was intelligence? End of calm. Not intelligence like ours. Not cities or internet. But something capable of reshaping the world around it. Something that understood balance and then, for whatever reason, broke it. This is the unsettling core of the Silurian Hypothesis. That intelligence may rise not just once, but cyclically. That civilizations might not be rare, but ephemeral. That they emerge, flourish, collapse, and vanish into geological silence. And that we, with all our sensors and satellites, might be the first to look back and ask, was anyone here before? If they were, their traces wouldn't be obvious. No monuments, no bones, but patterns, shifts in carbon and sulfur, anomalous sedimentation, fossil gaps. Not absence of life, but an interruption in its rhythm. And if that's true, then we must rethink how we define civilization. Not by scale, not by visibility, but by consequence. A civilization might speak through deforestation, through altered monsoon cycles, through a changed albedo that echoes into polar ice. These are not just effects, they're inscriptions. We assume history began when we started writing it down. But maybe history is older than memory. Maybe it's something the planet keeps, whether we're paying attention or not. Because time doesn't care about our narratives. It folds them, presses them, turns them into puzzle pieces for someone else to find. And we might be standing on one now. This idea isn't about proving aliens or rewriting textbooks. It's about humility, about seeing ourselves not as the pinnacle of evolution, but as one more verse in a deeper chorus, one that has sung before, one that might sing again. We are not the authors of Earth's story. We are its latest footnote. But perhaps, if we learn to read better, to listen not just to the loud layers, but the quiet ones, we may discover that intelligence is not a singular spark, but a rhythm, one that rises, falls, and sometimes returns. Because what returns is not always the same. Sometimes it echoes in form, sometimes only in function, but the earth remembers. Not as a mind remembers, but as a body does, in its scars, its pulses, its chemistry. And those memories, once translated, could become a map not to the past, but to the future. They might show us not just what was lost, but how to avoid the same fate. A warning carved in isotopes. A lesson whispered through extinction curves. So we must keep asking not just where are we going, but who walked here before? And more importantly, did they leave us something in the silence? There's a kind of silence that isn't empty but full. A silence that holds meaning too vast for language. The earth has always spoken in that silence. In the slow tilt of magnetic poles, in the rise and fall of ocean currents, in the breath of ancient glaciers. But we've only just begun to learn how to listen. We used to believe that civilization meant permanence. Roads, monuments, empires carved into stone. But now we know better. Civilization is delicate. It balances on the narrowest edge of climate, of chemistry, of coordination. And that balance, once broken, doesn't leave behind glory. It leaves behind questions. Questions like, why did the carbon levels spike in that layer? Why did so many species vanish quickly across continents with no clear cause? Why do some regions of sediment contain metals not associated with any known volcanic source? These aren't just holes in our knowledge, they're doors. To step through them is to leave certainty behind. It's to accept that the earth might have carried others, not myths, not aliens, but minds. Minds that rose, burned bright, and then fell into silence. Minds that altered their environment just as we have. Minds whose stories were not preserved in books or walls but in soil. And soil, when read correctly, is a manuscript of change. It holds the chemistry of past rains, the breath of extinct forests, the decay of bodies, biological or technological. So we start to read it differently. We run isotope analyses not just for dating, but for motive. We compare sediment layers not just to understand climate, but to sense intention. We look for patterns that feel too refined, too fast, too complete. Patterns that suggest not accident, but design. And in doing so, we begin to wonder, if someone else came before, what did they try to solve? Because that may be the most telling legacy of all. Not what they built, but what they broke, what they tried to fix, what they feared. We fear extinction, collapse, irrelevance. But maybe those fears are not unique to us. Maybe they echo across time, carried by every intelligent species that ever tried to play the long game on a changing planet. And maybe the traces they left aren't warnings but messages. Messages that say, we were here, we tried, learn from what remains. If we can learn to hear that, to read anomaly, not as noise, but as signal, we might not only find the past, we might save the future. Because to listen well is not just to uncover history, it is to rewrite destiny. And listening, perhaps, is the first true act of intelligence. Not invention, not expansion, but recognition of what came before, of what still lingers, of what might come again. Because the earth is not quiet, it is whispering. And now, at last, we are learning how to hear. Because the act of listening requires us to stop assuming we know what to hear, to question not just the data, but the lens we use to interpret it. We've built our sciences around predictability, around mechanisms we can reproduce. But the deepest truths may not repeat. They may only ripple once. And those ripples may be our only clues. So we trace them in isotopic signatures, in the silent loss of species, in the residual energy of cycles broken too soon. Each trace, a ghost. Each anomaly, a page from a book that no longer exists. And still, the story waits to be reread not in ink, but in ash. Because something happened here, and if we want to understand what might happen again, we must become historians of the unprovable, detectives of possibility, listeners of stone. And only then might we earn the right to call ourselves aware. Imagine a time before time had names. No calendars, no kings, just cycles oceanic, atmospheric, biological, turning endlessly. Somewhere within those turns, something happened. Not just life, but awareness. And with that awareness came consequence. That's where our story begins, not with creation myths, but with feedback loops, because every intelligent species eventually meets the edge of its own impact. And in the fossil record, those moments are preserved as disjunctions, sudden breaks, unnatural quiet. These aren't mysteries to be solved. They are mirrors to be studied. We are told civilization began with agriculture, with surplus, with cities. But what if that version of history only describes us? What if others walked the earth long before our stories began, ones that didn't need stone or steel to shape the world? What if their rise and fall is recorded not in relics but in runoff, in isotopic anomalies, in strange oceanic stutters that no volcano can explain? To consider this is to accept that intelligence might be older than evidence, that it may leave behind not tools, but tremors. And tremors ripple forward, through soil, through climate, through time. We find one in the mid-Permian, a biotic crisis without an obvious cause. Another in the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. Rapid warming with chemical traces that feel eerily contemporary. Each event layered in ambiguity, each a wound with no weapon, and each a possibility. But to truly understand what we're seeing, we have to change the way we see. We must treat the planet not as background but as collaborator, a recorder of action, a partner in consequence. The rock does not forget. It may distort, but it does not lie. So we become pattern seekers, noise sifters. We look at clay content, at iron oxides, at molecular leftovers. We trace the fingerprints of combustion that happened before matches. We model carbon surges without mammalian cause. We follow the drift of dust that suggests industry, not accident. And at the center of it all is a silence, a long pause in the song of life. And in that pause, something shifted, not ended, not exploded, just changed. If that change was caused by a mind, then that mind is gone. But its gesture remains, in the chemistry, in the climate, in the questions we ask when we stop assuming we were first. because being first isn't important. Understanding what came before is. And if we are lucky, if we are humble, maybe we'll recognize their mistake before we repeat it. Because that is the quiet power of this hypothesis, not that it rewrites our past, but that it reframes our future. If we are not the first, then extinction is not a tragedy. It's a possibility, a phase in a longer cycle. And that means we still have a choice: to listen, to learn, to become the first species to see the pattern and break it. Because breaking the pattern requires more than knowledge, it demands vision, the ability to see past our own reflection, to imagine intelligence that leaves no flag, no anthem, no structure, only subtle fingerprints on ecosystems, echoes in the chemical rhythm of time. And once we start to see them, we may realize this isn't just their story, it's ours too. Time does not ask for our permission. It moves, it folds, it forgets. And in its wake, the earth records not in ink, but in pressure, not in symbols, but in chemistry. So when we dig into ancient sediments, we're not uncovering relics. We're reading a language we barely understand. That language is filled with punctuation marks we don't expect, carbon spikes without fire, extinction patterns that defy catastrophe, metal traces with no known origin. These are not just curiosities, they're potential sentences, messages encoded in the very bones of the planet. And what they might be saying is this: someone was here before, not someone like us, not towers or tech, but a form of mind that moved through the world differently, one that altered without dominating, one that left no statues, only subtle distortions in what should have been a steady climb of biological entropy. We search for ruins, but maybe the ruins are systemic. Maybe they lie in the tipping points, those strange pivot moments when ecosystems didn't behave as expected, when evolution jumped too cleanly, when warming came too fast, when equilibrium broke, not from randomness, but from design. And what does it mean to design at the level of planet? It means leaving a signature in the biosphere, not in fossilized bones, but in atmospheric shifts, in sedimentary hesitation, in the interruption of feedback loops that should have persisted for millennia. We've begun to notice these things, the outliers, the stutters in Earth's otherwise smooth rhythm, and in doing so, we've stumbled into a kind of archaeology, not of things, but of consequences. Consequences so deep, they blur the line between cause and context. Because a vanished civilization might not disappear cleanly. Its after effects could linger in the soil, in the oceans, in the very architecture of survival. And the longer we study them, the more we find whispers that don't fit the story we've been telling. That's what makes this search different. We're not chasing myths. We're chasing evidence we were never taught to recognize. And in that evidence is a challenge in it just to our understanding of the past, but to our stewardship of the present. Because if others came before and failed, then failure is not an accident, it's a pattern. And to break that pattern, we must first admit we are inside it. Only then can we begin to write a new layer into the planet's memoryone that won't vanish as quietly as the rest. Because the Earth doesn't forget, it absorbs, it metabolizes, but it never deletes. Every breath of oxygen, every fluctuation in CO2, every dust grain in layered ice carries a timestamp. And within those timestamps are questions we haven't asked because we didn't know we could. Now we do, and that changes everything. To know we might not be first is to know we might not be last. It is to carry responsibility not just for survival, but for memory, for writing something into the stone that speaks not of collapse, but of continuity. If the Earth is a storyteller, then every extinction is a plot twist, every anomaly, a hidden footnote, and every echo we hear in the rock record is a question that hasn't stopped asking, what came before us? For centuries we believed the past was linear, primitive to advanced, single file through time. But time doesn't march, it loops, it bends, it erases, and in those erasures, we may find more truth than in what remains. We speak of civilization as if it's synonymous with buildings, with boundaries, with tools. But maybe that's only one expression. Maybe intelligence doesn't always strive to rise above nature. Maybe sometimes it dissolves into it. And if that's true, then we've been looking in the wrong places. The real artifacts may not be objects, but outcomes. Things that shouldn't have happened or happened too neatly. Global shifts in oxygen, a spike in biodiversity where extinction was expected. Sedimentary sequences that suggest a pause in natural processes like someone held their breath. That's what makes the Silurian Hypothesis so powerful. It doesn't argue for aliens or fantasy. It argues for method, for asking, how would we know if someone intelligent once lived here and left no buildings behind? We think we'd recognize it, but would we? Imagine a world tuned for equilibrium, a species that reached the peak of sustainability and then chose silence. No waste, no ruins, only balance, until something changed, a disruption, a decline, and eventually, disappearance. That kind of story wouldn't leave a signature in stone. It would leave it in systems, in abrupt recalibrations of climate, in soil chemistry, in the fossil record's blank spaces. It would look a lot like the anomalies we already see, which means the question isn't, where's the evidence? The question is, have we misread it? And if we have, what else have we misread? Because the deeper we dig, the more it seems that Earth's story is stranger than we imagined. Not a tale of slow ascent, but of cycles, crescendos, and collapses. Awareness rising from biology, shaping the biosphere, and then quiet. We fear that kind of quiet. We equate it with failure. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a form of grace. A decision not to dominate, but to disappear well. And maybe we're the first to reach the point of awareness with the tools to look back. If so, then our role is clear: to listen carefully, to question deeply, and to decide whether we want our trace to be noisy or signal. Because signal isn't loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's a subtraction of silence where noise should be, a missing element, a fossil gap, a statistical shadow that suggests something chose not to leave a mess. That kind of signal takes a new kind of hearing, not with instruments, but with imagination. Not fantasy, but disciplined curiosity. And if we listen hard enough, we may realize the Earth isn't just asking us what we know. It's asking if we're ready to know more. Because knowing more isn't about having the answers. It's about asking the right questions and being willing to hear what the planet has been whispering all along. In layers, in cycles, in code we are only just learning how to read. We often imagine extinction as a momenta flash, a fall, a final breath. But extinction is rarely loud. Most of the time, it's quiet, a slow fade, a soft disappearance that unfolds over centuries, invisible to the generations living through it. The same may be true of civilizations. Not every collapse comes with fire. Not every ending is marked by rubble. Sometimes a civilization dissolves like mist, its effects lingering in the atmosphere, the ocean, the soyong after its name has vanished. That's the unsettling possibility the Silurian Hypothesis invites us to face. That Earth's past may hold more than fossils and stone tools. It may hold stories of intelligence not written in books, but in systems. And stories leave residue. Not in monuments, but in chemistry. In the rhythm of sedimentation. In the inexplicable global changes that don't align with natural cycles. A spike in carbon unlinked to known volcanism. A rapid acidification with no comet. A sudden turnover in marine life that feels orchestrated. These are not conclusions. They are clues. And following them requires humility. Because we are not used to thinking of ourselves as just one possible version of thinking life. We assume uniqueness, destiny. But what if we are just the latest verse in a planetary chorus? That chorus may stretch back farther than we're comfortable imagining. And if so, the real legacy of past civilizations may not be their artifacts but their warnings. Echoes embedded in the very systems they disrupted. Echoes that we, too, are now beginning to produce. We see it in the Anthropocene's own geological fingerprint. Plastic in the deep sea, radiation in glacial ice. Chemical signatures that will endure long after we're gone. We are writing our own story into the rock, and the question is who will read it? Or perhaps more urgently, will they understand it? Because our trace may look like theirs. And if their story ended in silence, the comparison is not flattering. But there is still time to change our ending. We can learn from the subtle disruptions, the misplaced elements, the unexpected warmth in a layer of time. We can start to read the planet not as a passive backdrop, but as a partner in memory, one that records everything. And in that record, we may find the questions that matter most. Not who came first, but who lasted, and why. Because the past may be lost in dust, but the pattern it left behind still lives in us. And maybe, just maybe, it's still being written. Because stories are not just told through symbols, they are told through scars, through the curve of a coastline that shifted too suddenly, through coral that stopped growing all at once, through a silence in the pollen record, like a breath held far too long. These are the kinds of traces that minds leave behind, not always on purpose, but inevitably. And so we must listen not only with our instruments, but with our imagination. Because the planet may be whispering not just what happened, but what could happen again, unless we choose to listen in time. In the end, the question isn't whether someone came before us. It's whether we'll recognize the signs when we see them. For too long, we've expected the past to shout, to leave us monuments, skeletons, technologies. But what if it only left a breath, a shift in the wind, a momentary pause in the ocean's rhythm that no one thought to question until now? Because that's the haunting brilliance of the Silurian Hypothesis. It doesn't ask us to prove someone existed. It asks us to become better at noticing what existence actually leaves behind. We've built civilizations based on accumulation of material, of energy, of impact. But what if intelligence evolved in another form before? One that prized subtlety, one that learned how to leave quietly, one that didn't just rise, but chose to fade. Its fingerprint would not be one of noise, but of a silence that doesn't match its context. We might already be standing on its ruined sand, not even realize it. Think of the strange metal isotopes in unexpected places, the trace greenhouse events that spiked too fast, the changes in photosynthetic ratios without any matching evolutionary driver. These aren't answers, but they're invitations to stop thinking of ourselves as the center, to reimagine the story of Earth not as a ladder but as a spiral, one that loops through cycles of emergence, transformation, and vanishing. One where intelligence doesn't guarantee longevity but might leave behind the hope that someone else will notice, will do better. We are now, in real time, creating our own geological shadow. Plastics, synthetic compounds, fossil fuel signatures. Our echo will not be subtle. It will be sharp, stratified, unmistakable. And that contrast makes the quiet ones stand out. Because if another intelligent species once lived here and vanished in a way that barely disrupted the planetary song, then they knew something we haven't yet learned. They understood that the most enduring legacy is not control but coherence. So we dig, not just into dirt, but into meaning, into the spaces between facts, into the silences that shouldn't exist. And we ask, what would it mean to be remembered, not for our artifacts, but for our absence of harm? That may be the highest form of signal, and it may be the one we're still blind to, but not for much longer. Because the Earth is beginning to teach us how to listen, and it's not through words. It's through what should not be there and what is. The clues may not come in the form of machines or monuments, but in anomalies too persistent to dismiss, in methane shifts that resist explanation, in global temperature plateaus that defy expected forcing, in ecological events that feel choreographed. And perhaps in those subtle deviations, we are not just seeing history, we are feeling it. The breath of a vanished intelligence, still moving faintly beneath the surface of time, asking, through absence, what will you leave behind? Because legacies aren't built on visibility, they're built on resonance. And what resonates most is not power, but precision. Not conquest, but care. Maybe that's what the past is trying to show us. Not that it ended, but that it was listening too. We used to believe the earth was a blank slate, passive, silent, waiting to be written on. But now we know better. The earth is not a page. It is a palimpsesta layered memory of everything that ever was. Each layer tells a story, and some stories interrupt the rhythm. They leave questions in place of answers. They refuse to align with the narrative of slow, accidental change. That refusal is what draws us in. Because if intelligence has arisen before, if minds once shaped this world before vanishing into the folds of time, then those interruptions are where they speak. Not in words, but in shifts. In the chemistry of ancient oceans. In the strange absence of expected species. In climate patterns that turn too quickly, too completely. We call these events unexplained. But maybe they aren't. Maybe they are misunderstood. Because to see a vanished civilization, we must stop expecting it to resemble us. We must let go of the idea that intelligence always scales upward toward visibility, toward permanence, toward monuments. What if true intelligence lies not in scale, but in subtlety? What if the most advanced civilizations are not the ones that conquer nature, but the ones that become indistinguishable from it? To vanish without wreckage, to influence without scars, to pass through the world like wind, leaving only altered rhythms in biology and time. That kind of legacy would be hard to detect, but not impossible. We look to the Paleocene, to the Permian, to eras where something happened and no one knows why. The signals are faint, but they repeat, and in repetition, we find intent, or at least the ghost of it. That ghost challenges us. It forces us to confront the limits of our detection and of our imagination, because we are trained to see chaos in nature, to attribute change to randomness or disaster. But some changes are too smooth, too targeted, as if life itself was being nudged, not controlled, just tuned. And tuning is a kind of authorship. It is a quiet script, one we are only beginning to hear. The question now is, will we continue to listen? Because in those faint, persistent echoes of the past, we may not just find lost minds, we may find a reflection of what we could become. If we're willing to shift our story too, because to shift the story means accepting that we are not the only authors, that the planet has hosted many minds, that we may be one of many experiments in awareness, in adaptation, in impact, and that the most successful experiment may not be the one that lasted the longest, but the one that left the least damage. Perhaps that's the true legacy of intelligence. Not domination, not survival, but integration. To live in such harmony with the systems of Earth that disappearance is not a tragedy, but a return. A return not to nothing, but to balance. And in that balance, we might just find the key to our own. We once believed history was a straight line, but now, standing in the echo of what might have been, we realize the line bends, it coils, it sings, and if we listen closely, we might find that we are not its start. We are simply its next note. There's a question we don't often ask when we look back through time. What does it mean to disappear well? We assume disappearance is failure, that collapse equals chaos, but not every ending is violent. Some are chosen. Some are woven so deeply into the planet's processes that they feel more like a transition than a fall. That's what makes the Silurian Hypothesis so radical. It invites us to imagine that intelligence could exist not to conquer, but to harmonize. And in doing so, to vanish so cleanly it leaves behind only elegance, only equilibrium. No ruined cities, no poisoned skies, just a slight anomaly in an otherwise steady rhythm. A brief moment when the Earth paused, adjusted, and continued. We wouldn't know what to look for. We're trained to search for wreckage. But what if the trace of intelligence isn't destruction but coherence? A sudden lack of entropy, a spontaneous balance that shouldn't exist. Like a chorus that quieted all at once. That kind of footprint is difficult to see, but not impossible. It requires a new kind of vision that pays attention not just to presence, but to absence, to patterns that shouldn't be as smooth as they are, to recoveries that came too fast, to the missing scars of what should have been disaster. And perhaps, if we look closely, we'll begin to see them. Not everywhere, but in just enough places to make us wonder, was something here once that understood how to leave lightly? And if so, what did they know? Because leaving lightly is not the same as being forgotten. It is a form of respect, a form of memory. It is a message written not in monuments but in restraint, the kind of message we are only just beginning to understand. And it asks of us not reverence but reflection, not belief but humility, to imagine that we are not the first, that intelligence may have risen more than once, and that perhaps the highest form of intelligence is not the loudest, but the least invasive. That is the paradox at the heart of this mystery. To find something that tried not to be found. To learn from a voice that chose to fall silent before it was silenced. And maybe, in that silence, we'll hear what matters most. Not how they lived, but how they chose to leave. And perhaps that is the legacy they hoped to leave, not one of power, but of possibility. That others might come and ask better questions. That someone might look past the tools and toward the silence. That disappearance could be an act of generosity, not defeat. Because in a world where everything fights to leave a mark, to leave none at all may be the most remarkable mark of all. A legacy written in the decision not to dominate but to dissolve. And maybe that is the most important story the Earth has to tell. We may never know their names. We may never find their cities. But if they lived and chose to vanish with care, then that choice itself is a message, a quiet signal. And now, it is our turn to decide what kind of signal we will become. There's a strange comfort in believing we are alone in our story, that we are the first, the most advanced, the only ones to have shaped the Earth so deeply. But that comfort may be an illusion. And illusions, like all fragile things, eventually crack. The more we study the past, the more we see those cracks. Subtle, silent, persistent. We see them in sediment cores pulled from the deep ocean layers where life stumbled, then rebounded too quickly. We see them in chemical signatures that should not be there, or should be elsewhere. We see them in the rhythm of extinction and recovery, too precise to be random, too patterned to be natural. And the more we learn, the more the question echoes not, were we first? But would we even know? Because recognizing a vanished intelligence requires a shift in thinking, a willingness to look for intention, not in artifacts, but in outcomes, not in ruins, but in remainders, in the chemistry of the atmosphere, in the geometry of recovery. Imagine a species that understood sustainability, not as a goal, but as a principle, that learned to live within planetary limits not by necessity, but by design, that chose eventually to disappear, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in learning when to stop. That is a story we're not prepared to hear, because it contradicts our own own hunger to grow, to reach, to persist at all costs. But perhaps it is the story we need most, because in that arc of silence, we may find a blueprint, a model of intelligence that does not climax in dominance, but in dissolution, in blending back into the world with such precision that only a few ripples remain. Ripples we are only now beginning to notice. We call them anomalies, but maybe they are invitations to imagine differently, to act differently, to accept that the Earth has hosted more than just biology, that it may have carried memory, intention, awareness many times over, and that each time the message left behind was not, "Look what we built," but, "See what we chose to leave untouched." And now it's our turn to decide what we will touch and what we will leave behind. Because what we leave behind is not just a record of what we did, it's a reflection of who we were. Will we be remembered for extraction or restoration, for urgency or patience, for endless growth or knowing when to let go? The Earth will remember either way. Its memory is not biased. It does not reward ego. It only records. And in that record, the quietest signals often last the longest. So maybe the true test of intelligence is not how loud we shout into history, but how carefully we choose to whisper into the future. Because whispers travel differently than noise. They linger, they wait, and sometimes they are heard by those who were never meant to hear them but who need to. Maybe that's us. And if it is, then this moment is not just a turning point. It is a reply. There's a kind of humility that comes with realizing we are not the center of the story, that Earth's narrative didn't begin with use and won't end with us either. That long before we lit our first fire or etched our first symbol, the world had already seen wonders and losses, and perhaps other minds. Not minds like ours, not bound by the same desires or tools, but minds that shaped ecosystems, not empires, that etched their presence not in ruins but in rhythms, in changes we still don't fully understand. We call them anomalies, unexplained warming periods, fossil turnovers, sudden disappearances of species, events that rewrite the planet's trajectory without an obvious trigger. But maybe the trigger was thought, not accident, not asteroid, but awareness. That idea is uncomfortable. It suggests that we are not special, that we are part of a much older pattern that includes intelligence as a phase, not a pinnacle, a phase that may be temporary. We often speak of legacy in terms of what we build, what we leave behind, but legacy can also be absence, the kind of absence that makes space for something new, something better. Perhaps past civilizations learned that. Perhaps they reached a point where their presence threatened the balance and chose to recede, not out of weakness, but wisdom. And now, here we are, facing the same thresholds, carbon rising, oceans shifting, ecosystems faltering. We are leaving a mark, but it is not the one we hoped for. Our trace is heavy, loud, unmistakable, but not yet irreversible. If others came before us, they may not have had the tools to see themselves in time, to adjust, to adapt. We do, and that gives us a choice. We can continue forward, insisting we are alone, unique, invincible, or we can pause. We can listen. We can ask, what would it mean to become a civilization that vanishes with grace, not in collapse, but in contribution, to become a layer in the earth that future minds will look back on not with confusion, but with gratitude, because we left the planet better than we found it, because we chose to become part of the balance, not the break, and because we finally understood being remembered is not as important as being kind. Kindness, in this context, is not sentiment. It is structure. It is the deliberate design of systems that last not because they dominate, but because they cooperate. To be kind is to think forward, to see future layers of the earth as our audience, to ask, what will they need to understand us, and what will they wish we had done differently? Perhaps they won't need monuments or machines. Perhaps they'll only need to see that at some point, someone noticed the pattern and chose not to repeat it. That may be the clearest signal we can leave. Not invention, not survival, but intention. And in that intention, something remarkable happens. We stop trying to escape the earth and begin learning how to belong to it. Fully, finally. quietly, like those who may have walked here before us. When we study the past, we usually search for noise-shattered bones, charred remnants, the heavy marks of conflict and collapse. But what if the most meaningful traces are not found in the noise? What if the deepest intelligence is found in the quiet? Because there's a different kind of archaeology, one, not of stone, but of subtlety. And it suggests that not all who rise to power leave behind ruins. Some leave behind balance. Some choose not to be remembered, but to be absorbed. And in doing so, they may have left behind the rarest thing of all, a clean exit. The more we refine our tools, the more we see patterns that don't make sense, periods of unexpected stability, climate shifts that begin and end too abruptly, biological transitions that look too coordinated to be chance. These aren't answers, but they are disruptions, and disruptions are where stories begin. We may never know for certain if an ancient civilization once walked this earth in a way that defied our expectations, but the very act of considering it changes us. It teaches us to look with more care, to read the earth not as a resource but as a text that holds more than history. It holds questions. And the most pressing one is no longer, were they here? It's, are we listening? Because to listen is to be changed. To see ourselves not as the culmination, but as a chapter. To recognize that our power lies not in how long we last, but in how well we learn. And the lesson may be this, that vanishing can be an art, that a truly advanced civilization might not expand endlessly, but contract deliberately, might not seek to dominate, but to dissolve, to make room for what comes next. What if that's what legacy really is? Not a statue in the desert, but a decision not to build it in the first place. Not a monument, but a moment of pause, a breath of restraint that says, we were here, we understood, and we chose harmony. We're still writing our layer in the earth, and every day we decide what kind of trace we leave. Heavy or light, loud or quiet, disruptive or deliberate. The past may be gone, but its silence still speaks. The question is, will we answer with noise or with grace? Grace is not absence. It is presence measured, intentional, aware. It's the decision to step gently instead of stamping loudly, to give more than we take, to leave fewer questions than we found, or better yet, to leave better questions. Because maybe the goal is not to be remembered forever. Maybe it's to be remembered well. And perhaps the most profound echo we can leave behind isn't in stone or steel but in balance restored. And if one day, far into the future, another mind stumbles across our signal, may it not find sorrow, but stewardship. Not a warning, but a whisper. Not destruction, but a decision to be part of something larger than ourselves. That would be a story worth discovering. The further we look back, the more the past resists clarity. Its edges blur, its voices fade. But sometimes, what's missing speaks louder than what remains. Not every silence is empty. Some are intentional. And perhaps, somewhere in the deepest layers of Earth's memory, lies a silence like that dense, deliberate, and filled with meaning we have yet to decode. The Silurian Hypothesis does not just ask us to reconsider history, it asks us to reconsider possibility. That Earth may not just be a home to life, but to lives. Not a single story, but a recurring song. And maybe intelligence is not rare, but fleeting. A pattern that rises, learns, and then dissolves not out of failure, but as a gesture of understanding. A willingness to return what was borrowed. If that's true, then every generation is not just a continuation, but a choice. We choose how deeply we dig, how broadly we listen, how carefully we interpret. And in that choice, something remarkable happens. We stop being just observers of history. We become part of its rhythm. Because this is not about ancient cities or forgotten machines. It's about resonance. A resonance we feel when we notice the odd alignments in geologic time. the unnatural consistency of recovery, the echo of logic in events that should be random. It's as if the past is trying to be seen, but only by those willing to look sideways, not straight ahead, not with certainty, but with wonder. Because maybe wonder is the only real tool we have left. It's what lets us hear what isn't spoken. It's what keeps the questions alive. And those questions matter because they shape how we live, how we build, how we end. If we are the first, then we must learn what it means to leave a legacy without damage. If we are not the first, then someone already tried. Either way, the responsibility is the same: to live in a way that invites gratitude from the future. Not confusion, not regret, but thanks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for learning. Thanks for leaving something worth finding. What if the most powerful evidence isn't buried in stone but in patterns? In the sudden stability of an unstable era? In the missing chaos where chaos should have reigned? We're taught to look for ruins. But maybe what remains is not structure but subtlety. Maybe intelligence doesn't build louder, it grows quieter. And the most advanced form of civilization is the one that chooses in full awareness to fade gently. That idea changes everything. It reframes our role, our ambitions, our obligations. It reminds us that legacy is not defined by what survives, but by what was spared. And perhaps the greatest trace we can leave is not a monument etched in stone, but a moment preserved in balance. A signal not of strength, but of sensitivity. A sign that we were not just here, but that we understood. And in that understanding, we didn't just live. We listened. We learned. And finally, we left something better behind. What do we become when we finally realize we're not alone, not in space, but in time? That question lingers. It lingers in the dust of vanished epochs, in the sediment that holds both memory and mystery, in the spaces between eras where silence grows thick, stand meaning most fragile. This is where the Silurian Hypothesis leaves us. Not with proof, not with certainty, but with a mirror. A mirror that doesn't show our reflection, but our potential. Because maybe the real discovery is not that someone came before us, but that someone thought about what would come after. That someone planned for legacy not as domination, but as discretion. To walk softly, to contribute, to complete their cycle, then vanish in a way that did not disrupt but restored. That kind of exit is rare and powerful. It turns civilization from an accident into an art form, and it challenges us, here and now, to ask, what kind of story are we writing? We've mastered extraction, innovation, expansion, but have we mastered restraint? Have we learned how to live with the future in mind? Because this earth doesn't need more empires. It needs caretakers, not conquerors but listeners, not builders but rememberers, not rulers but stewards. This is the wisdom buried in ancient anomalies, the lesson not written in stone, but in pattern, in pauses, in decisions that echo not through noise, but through quiet. We may never find their names, their language, their architecture, but we might find their wisdom in how they chose to leave the world behind. Whole, unburdened, waiting, and now that world is ours to hold. To continue the story not louder, but wiser. To build what needs building. To unbuild what harms. To carry forward not just technology, but tenderness. Because the next intelligence that walks this earth may not be looking for monuments. It may be looking for mercy. And if we leave that behind, then maybe we haven't just existed. Maybe we've mattered. Because meaning isn't just made in moments of grandeur, it's made in grace. In the willingness to take less, to tread lightly, to honor what came before by making space for what comes next. Maybe the most intelligent act isn't to survive forever, but to leave behind the conditions where something else can thrive. And if we are capable of that, then we are capable of more than progress. We are capable of wisdom, of humility, of echoing not just through time, but with care. Perhaps that is the quiet revolution waiting within us, not to be remembered as the most powerful species, but as the most mindful, the one that chose to pause, to recalibrate, to listen, and in doing so, became not the last, but the bridge between what was and what could still be. And if that's the story we leave behind, then we haven't just asked the right questions, we've become the answer. That answer may not come in stone or steel, but in the soil, in the seeds we plant, in the futures we protect, and in the silence we preserve for others to hear themselves. That is how we last. Not forever, but long enough to matter. The signal fades, the noise settles, and somewhere in the distance, the earth exhales. We've wandered far through deep time beyond the bones of history, into the silences between layers, tracing the possible footprints of minds lost to memory, not to solve the past, but to sit with it. Because the most powerful truths are not always the loudest. They linger in questions, in echoes, in wonder. And maybe what matters isn't whether the Silurian hypothesis is true, but that it made us look, that it invited us to see the Earth not just as a stage, but as a story, one still being written. There are still patterns we don't understand, layers we haven't reached, and stories folded so deeply into the bedrock that only patience will reveal them. But that's the point. Mystery is not an absence, it's an opening. And if this journey stirred something in you, if it made you pause, tilt your head, or feel a deeper hum behind the facts than you've heard it to, the invitation to listen more carefully, to wonder more freely, to question more kindly, because the truth is not always at the end of a path. Sometimes it's in the way we walk it. And if you want to walk further with Yusuf, you crave stories that haunt the edge of understanding, that live between science and silence, then stay with us. This was just one story. There are more. Subscribe, follow, and come with us into the quiet corners, the forgotten trails, the places not yet mapped, because the past isn't over. It's waiting, and some echoes are just beginning to speak.